Good morning, everybody. So this is the first coronavirus home lesson. Because this unit we're doing is safeguarding, it just seems particularly important that I'm going to be able to talk you through some of the stuff as well as send you things on the computer. It's probably the most important unit that we do, so it just seems essential that you have a bit more input from me, really, so you're fully comfortable with it. So today we're going to be looking at two things. 1.1, which is identify current legislation and guidelines for safeguarding the welfare of children and young people within the UK home nation, so England. And 1.2, describe how safeguarding and welfare requirements can be met through policies and procedures. So before you have looked at this video, it's a good idea if you can have a look at the safeguarding introduction YouTube clip called What is Safeguarding? So you might want to pause the video and have a look at that. The other things you need to be thinking about is the PowerPoints that I'm going to be talking through. So the first PowerPoint is 1.1. It's got a picture of some kids jumping up and down on it, so you might want to have again stop the video and print it off, or maybe you've got two devices so you can have a look at the slides while I talk about them. I've numbered all the slides so we can sort of keep up together. Okay, so safeguarding. It's used to become more commonly known as child protection, and then they changed the term. And I think when you think about child protection, you think about sort of protecting children, taking direct action. When you think about safeguarding, it's more about giving an atmosphere where you can operate safely. So it's more like having practices and procedures and a working environment where children are safe, rather than having to sort things out and suddenly protect them. Do you see what I mean? Child protection seems a bit more firefighty, where safeguarding is just working in a way where things can't actually get to that point. It's kind of subtle. Anyway, so let's look at these PowerPoint things. So let's start with slide 3. So there's a definition here which is from the government. So safeguarding protects children from maltreatment. It prevents the impairment of children's health and development and ensures that children grow up being provided with safe and effective care. Takes action to enable all children have the best outcomes. So that's what the government wants for all children in the country, and it seems quite a reasonable set of things. When we're talking about maltreatment, we're talking about making sure that children have enough to eat, that they have shelter, that their needs are met, that they're not being abused in any way, they're not being treated cruelly, all of these things. You think kind of basically what everybody would want for their child. But it's interesting, if we look at slide 4, there's a picture of Jimmy Savile. I don't know if you're familiar with Jimmy Savile, I'm sure most of you are. So Jimmy Savile was a really famous children's TV presenter and disc jockey in the 60s. And recently, well, in the last 10 years, there's been a massive scandal about the fact that he was also a really predatory paedophile. But in the culture in the 1960s was such that if you were somebody who was in a powerful position, if you were a teacher or a doctor or a policeman, or if you were somebody famous, people treated you with a lot of respect. I mean, growing up in the 70s, all the adults, you would never call an adult by their first name. You'd always call them Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, or really close family friends, you'd call auntie or uncle. You never called, children never called grown-ups by their first names. It was a much more sense of kind of respect and politeness, and that's just how things were. And it kind of went to quite an extreme, whereas if a teacher or a doctor or somebody in a professional position would give you advice or information, you wouldn't really question it. People didn't really feel that they had the right. And because information wasn't shared out in the way that we can access information about our health and about our rights and about all sorts of things like that. Before the internet, you know, you were very reliant on the people who had the knowledge and the information. And, you know, you didn't challenge, you know, that you didn't challenge people like that. Parents had full responsibility for their children in the 60s and 70s, and the government and local authorities didn't really interfere in the way that they do now. They didn't play a very big part at all, which leads us on to slide 5. So there's a picture of a little girl called Maria Colwell, and she died in 1975. And I remember this case because it was absolutely massive. There was real uproar. She was on like front page news for quite a long time. I've got a runny nose. And the story of Maria Colwell is that she was part of a family of 5 children. They lived in Brighton. The family were known to Children's Services and the NSPCC, the National Society for Protection of Cruelty to Children, because there had been some like physical violence in the family. There was an alcoholic stepfather. You know, it was a pretty rough and ready situation. And the short, sad life of Maria Colwell ended up with this girl who was 10 years old, who was so malnourished she could be sort of fitted into a child's pushchair, and was wheeled to Brighton Hospital, this little malnourished body, by her stepfather, and just left at the entrance of Brighton Hospital. And you know, people had known that there was something wrong, and nobody had stepped in. And this tragic case prompted a lot of public outrage, and people really wanted to see something happen. I remember my mum talking about it to her friends. It was really shocking, and because there were photographs, and it was, you know, Brighton's not a million miles away, it all seemed like things were really out of control. There was another case, the case of Victoria Climbié. If you have a look at slide 6, beautiful little girl. She was born in Africa, on the Ivory Coast, and she was sent to London to live with her aunt to get a good education, because, you know, London was seen as a place of really good opportunities. Her aunt had a boyfriend called Carl Manning, who was a monster, I think you can probably say. And this poor little girl, you know, was tortured. She had hypothermia. She was covered in bruises and burns. Absolutely horrific. And again, you know, very public inquiry launched. And when they looked into the case, let me just rearrange my paperwork. Have a look at slide 7. It turned out that actually loads of people knew that there was trouble with this family setup. There were 4 social services departments that had been involved, that had come round. There'd been 2 housing departments, so neighbours had said, you know, there's a problem, we can hear things going on, this doesn't sound good. 2 doctors had seen Victoria Climbié, and she'd also been to hospital on a couple of occasions because her injuries were so severe. There'd been concern at a family centre from the NSPCC. There was a childminder who'd reported concerns, and the family also went to church quite a lot, and the people there had been concerned as well. Loads and loads of people knew that there was something wrong. And when the inquiry was launched, it was led by Lord Lamming, who is a member of the House of Lords now, still working. And he was also a social worker. And he did this really extensive overview into what was happening with child protection. Have a look at slide 8. There's a thing about key themes. And he decided that child protection in this country was given a really low priority. Staff weren't properly trained to really understand the signs of abuse. There was no sort of a procedure to follow if you were concerned with a child, so everyone would do something a bit different. A lot of people would think that somebody else would do something. There was real problems in the way that information was exchanged, and basically the main finding of the Lord Lamming inquiry was that there was no joined up thinking. So lots and lots of people had little bits of information, but there was no process by which all those bits of information were all slotted together. So all the different agencies could actually build a picture. Lots of people had like a piece of the puzzle, but there was nothing actually put there together to make a proper policy where everyone knew what to do. So this work led to the Children Act, developments in the Children Act 2004, and we're going to have a look at that act in a minute. The next slide you have here is the Soham murders, and this is another of the big events which really provoked legislation and changes in the way that things were operated. So we touched on the Soham murders before when we were talking about issues around health and safety when we were looking at that unit. So the Soham murders, they were 2002, and there were Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, two 10-year-old girls. Ian Huntley was the caretaker at the school that they went to, and he was going out with their favourite lovely teaching assistant, Maxine Carr. And basically, you'll probably remember the stories. They disappeared one Sunday afternoon on the way to a barbecue. Ian Huntley was interviewed by the news. He led the hunt to try and find the kids. He was really involved in all of that, and it turned out that he had raped and murdered them and hidden the bodies. But what also transpired from that is that he had changed his name on a couple of occasions. He had a string of sort of sexual offences under different names. His references hadn't been checked by the school when he started there, and it was this, these obvious, when you look at it, obviously ridiculous things that led to the Bitchard inquiry in 2004, which then led to what was initially called the CRB, but then is the DBS checks, the disclosure and barring service checks, that everybody that works with vulnerable people and children have got to have, whereby you have your information sent to a computer where any evidence of any criminal offence is logged. And so, and you'll know for yourself if you're volunteering in schools or if you're involved in like Rainbows or Scouts or anything like that, you have a DBS certificate, and it just checks that there's nothing in your history that needs to be known. It's a small thing, and it's not perfect. It doesn't mean that you're a good person. It just doesn't mean that you haven't been caught. But it would have, it does make it much more difficult for people and working in schools now. And schools are really, really rigorous with their checks. I think largely since the Soham murders. Often, if there's a delay with DBS checks and you are in school, you are always in the company of another adult. When I have guest speakers come into Eastleigh College, I'm not allowed to let them out of my sight. Because if they don't have a DBS check, you've got to remain with them all the time. They have to be so careful. They really do. Ooh. Okay. So let's have a look at slide 11. By law, all organisations working with children and young people up to the age of 18 need to have policies and procedures to ensure their safety. And these policies and procedures will really inform how these things happen in schools. Our next PowerPoint thing, I'll talk you through the 1.2, goes a bit more detail into that. So slide 12, the main legislation that we need to be looking at and what you'll be asked to consider for your assessment. So we've got the Care Act of 2014, the Children's Act, which was initially started in 1989 and then updated with the things from the Climbié inquiry in 2004. We've got the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, and we have got Prevent Duty and the Fundamental British Values, also of 2015. So all quite recent stuff, really. As the world changes, so does the legislation. So let's look at slide 13. That's the Care Act, and this is designed to protect vulnerable people. So people with mental and physical disabilities, people who are dependent on medicine, people who are ill, people who are unable to take care of themselves for whatever reason. Then we have the Children Act 1989, so we'll look at the original Act, and this identifies the responsibility of parents and professionals to ensure child safety. What was really key in this is in section 17 it states that local authorities have a responsibility to ensure services are in place to safeguard children. That was a big thing. Section 47 says that local authorities also must investigate where there is suspicion that a child is suffering. So it moves a lot of responsibility from the family to the local authority to put in place the things that need to happen to make sure, if there's any suspicion that a child is being harmed in any way. Then we have the updated bits in 2004. And this was to talk about the way that organisations have a duty to safeguard children. They also, information being shared, all the things that they learnt from the Maria Colwell and the Victoria Climbié experiences, sharing information. They also appointed a Children's Commissioner of England who was going to oversee issues surrounding children. Currently, this post is held by Anne Longfield. You sometimes see her on the news or hear her on the radio. Counter-Terrorism and Security Act is slide 16. So this is quite a fresh one. This act aims to prevent young children being drawn into terrorist acts or being radicalised. So the kind of groups who generally are keen to radicalise children are usually sort of single issue groups, so religious or political. Currently, Animal Liberation Front is quite a thing. We've had, I think I mentioned, there's been a rise of sort of anti-Semitic feeling in and around Eastleigh College, so we've had some things on that, and also lots of far right groups. So when people are trying to sign up members for these groups, you're looking for children, young people who are a bit vulnerable, often maybe a bit socially isolated, maybe not having a very good time with their family and feeling like nobody really gets them, and they're really ripe sort of for joining into things. Young people see things in a very black and white way, and it's a time with teenagers, particularly when they're really pushing against home and they don't feel like anybody really understands them, and then there's someone with really sort of black and white ideas. It can be very attractive. Which leads us on to slide 17, the Prevent Duty and Fundamental British Values. And this is guidance referring to the Counter-Terrorism Act. It gives schools a lot of responsibility in looking out for signs of radicalisation. Staff have got to be trained in spotting signs, knowing what to do, following training plans as an annual training that all members of staff have got to do in schools. It gives you quite a solid understanding of what to look for, because lots of the things that you can see with children being drawn into extremism, spending a lot of time in their rooms, not wanting to engage with parents, being secretive with their phones, changing their appearance, that's actually sort of classically teenage, isn't it? So there's all sorts of things that schools are taught to look out for specifically. There's also some software that schools and colleges have. I can't remember what it's called. It's called something like, there's no point making it up, is there? I can't remember what it's called. But what it does, it looks at everyone's search history, or the student's search history. So if people are, searching how to commit suicide or make bombs or anything which like that, it flags up and it sends emails and like a report to the safeguarding team. And depending, there was a funny thing the other week at college, because they're one of the I can't remember what it was. They'd been asked to research something for homework, and all of a sudden there was like 25 reports about explosives or something from some subject, and obviously everyone was like, oh my god. they're going to blow up the college, but it was actually homework. So it's, you know, it's a really good way of you know, college trying to keep an eye on what everyone's looking at. Slide 18, statutory documents, guidance documents created by the government, which need to be read by staff to help understand the safeguarding responsibilities. And these will be given to you when you start working, like a booklet form. Keeping children safe in education and working together to safeguard children. There's lots of other things you get as well, lots of things about lifting heavy boxes, but in terms of safeguarding, those are the key bits. So slide 19, the role of Ofsted. So one of the things that Ofsted will always inspect and will always be looking out for is the way that schools enforce and record safeguarding. So they will be looking at, you know, what happens in terms of when reports are made, what happens to that information, what the follow-up is, and that they need to make sure that their adequate policies and procedures are in place. Slide 20 is a picture of Blake Fowler, little lad in Shirley, who died, you know, 2011, not very long ago at all. He was only 7 when he died. And again, with him, there were some really long-term concerns people had. So from the age of 14 months, you know, he's in hospital with burns and bruising. When he was 3, the police were called because some workmen who were working on a neighbouring house saw this little 3-year-old tottering around drinking like vodka in the garden, you know, very unusual things like that. When he started school, he had a bruised face. Awful. There were loads, again, like the other children we looked at, loads of missed opportunities. You look at slide 21, 18 missed opportunities. So at preschool and school, staff failed to make child protection referrals despite explicit evidence of injury. So even though it was very obvious that things were very wrong, for some reason they just did not push it. They did not follow it up. The school nurse took no further action when she was told by Ben that he'd been hit. A health visitor didn't follow up after seeing, you know, possible injuries that could have happened at home. Lots of missed opportunities when he was admitted to hospital, as he was on several occasions. So despite all the legislation, you know, sometimes people are still reluctant. I mean, 2011, it's quite a long time ago. Since I've been working in schools, it's so drummed into you, the steps that you have to take and the steps that we're going to be looking at really closely in this unit, because support workers, more than any other people really, are so have the opportunity to really observe these things, because the relationships you build often with the most vulnerable children, it means you are usually the first person they're going to speak to if there's a problem or an issue. It's really you know, it's really key that everybody really understands how important that kind of communication is, and how careful you have to be in the questions that you're asking and the way that you're logging information. And we're going to talk a lot about that, because if there's any sense that a child is in a situation and you have kind of led them into talking about things, it can really jeopardize things later on. So there's very, very clear procedure about what to do if a child says something to you. Oh, we're going to look at that a lot. The result of the Ben Fowler case led to the MASH, the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. And you've probably seen posters for these and stickers in schools and in community centres. If you have a look at slide 22. And what it is, it's one phone number. If you've got any concerns, any member of the public can ring up and they can just speak to somebody who will be in contact with, you know, the police and social services, children's services, all of that kind of stuff. And you can, you know, you can just log your concern there. They will get back to you and let you know that things are happening. They might not go into very much detail, but it's a really useful piece of sort of joined up thinking. And when we looked at the earlier cases where people had one bit of the puzzle, the multi-agency safeguarding hub means that it's a place where people are working together all of the time, so they know who they need to speak to in the other departments, in the other areas. So it just means that it makes it much more effective. The last slide, safeguarding children is everybody's responsibility, and that's something that you really will always be aware of, no matter whatever child you have with you. You just always have to think, don't you, this is my child, I'm here for this child, and to leave it to anybody else to think, oh well, maybe I haven't picked this up, maybe I won't go and report this, you know, that's not how you can do it. If you go to see the safeguarding designated leader at your school, and you're the 5th or 6th member of staff that goes in with the same concern about a child, it all just goes to show that the system is working, and that children are being looked after. Right, okay. If you would like to have a little stop there and maybe have a cup of tea, that would be fine. And then we're going to talk about the second one, which is 1.2, and this is a much shorter one. Okay, so if you want to stop now. Okay, back on. So 1.2, describe how safeguarding and welfare requirements can be met through policies and procedures. So slide 2. Working with children and vulnerable adults, everyone has got a responsibility to protect welfare and safety. It's everybody's human right. Under the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, you may remember, to be protected, as well as being the right thing to do. What are you protecting them from exactly? Well, you are going to be protecting them from all types of abuse. So sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect used to be the 4 things that were always cited as being abuse, but now there's 9 sorts of abuse, which we will be looking at later. Hooray. Bullying, again, that's something that you will be expected to be protecting them from. Radicalisation, and I don't know how familiar you are with the whole county lines situation. The risks to children vary massively depending where they live, and the county lines model is a very successful way of drug dealers using vulnerable children to carry drugs out of big city centres and into sort of rural communities. So again, be looking for vulnerable children, isolated young people, and some of these children are like, you know, sort of 10, 11 years old, really, really young. They show an interest, they give them sort of a bit of grooming goes on, there's jewellery and money and a sense of belonging that can be very attractive to young people, and then they, you know, given nice phones and a rucksack full of drugs and stuck on a train and using public transport, then they will, you know, take drugs out of city centres and into rural communities. So it's an absolute massive problem, and it's very, very difficult for the police to clamp down on. But it's something that it happens everywhere. I mean, at Eastleigh College, we've had quite a few cases of county lines action. Sometimes, you know, that you find yourself in a situation at work, and you can't really believe that the children that you're working with and dealing with, you know, are having such a difficult time and having to make difficult choices all the time. But they really are. And you know, you sort of get your eye in quite early on, and you learn to be observant, and particularly the children that will try and keep you at arm's length for whatever reason are often the ones you need to get closest to. Can be quite challenging. Slide 4. How do policies and procedures help? Policies and procedures in terms of safeguarding are really essential, because it means that everybody has a really, really, really clear idea of what to do. It means that the level of response is identical no matter where you are. It means that if you're moving between schools, the policies and the procedures are largely the same. It means that staff know what's expected of them. It means that people who are are the named people, it's very, very clear exactly what their duties are. And because if they're so monitored by Ofsted, you know, it means that the records and everything have to be absolutely really, really tight. It's recognised as being one of the most important things in school. There's regular annual training for every single member of staff, and that usually happens on the inset days at the beginning of term. It has to be freshened up all the time, and also because the situation changes every year. So when I started in schools, there was, as I say, four types of abuse, and now there's 9. The laws change all the time, the way that things are, the way that threats change all the time. Quite often with safeguarding, there will be sort of extra staff meetings if there's maybe a situation in the area where there's a new threat from maybe extreme right-wing groups or a religious group that's, you know, the police will contact schools and let staff know, and then you need to be aware of it. So it changes all the time. It's certainly not one of those bits of policy and procedure that remains the same year in, year out. It's always quite different. Every school has a DSL, a designated safeguarding lead, and these are the people that when you have concerns, you know, you will go to without discussing concerns with other members of staff. That's where you'll go. And as I say, you know, they would much rather lots of people came with the same concern, because, you know, it has to really take priority. The DSL is a fantastic thing to have, because if you never want to go home at the end of the school day worrying about a child. If you speak to the DSL as soon as you've got a concern, you know then that you have given the information to the right person who will then take some steps to make sure things are set in motion. And it might just be them talking to the child, it might be them bringing somebody in from the school. No matter what's going on, the DSL will drop everything to speak to you if you've got a safeguarding concern. And similarly, if you've got a safeguarding concern, you have to drop everything as well to make sure, you know, because that has got to be the priority. Slide 5. What sort of policies are there which relate to safeguarding? Well, there's quite a lot actually. It comes onto quite a lot of things, that really. So acceptable use of technology, so keeping children safe online, which we've already looked at quite a bit with our health and safety module. But that in terms of, you know, extremism, radicalisation, how to self-harm, you know, all sorts of things like that. You know, that's making sure that schools have got the right filters in place. We have quite a good look at that as we go through this unit. Also, we need to think about policies relating to staff and pupils' communications and relationships. So that's quite clearly laid out. And we've spoken about, you know, never sharing numbers or personal contacts or pictures on phones, all of that kind of stuff. The use of social media is really important. Sometimes they are included in specific policies, the social media and e-safety things, but sometimes they're part of child protection policy. But lots of policies will do things like looking at, well, obviously, you know, how to respond to abuse. What other things we can think of for safeguarding? Lots of things really, everything that keeps children safe, and it comes into all different sorts of areas. Anyway, so what I would like to do then is, if you haven't been able to look at me and look at the PowerPoint at the same time, because I've numbered them and I've referred to the numbers as I've gone, you should be able to match that in together. And then there'll be some further instructions on what to do for the rest of the lesson on your email. So it's a bit weird just talking to me, but anyway, hopefully you'll find this helpful. Okay, all right, take care, stay well, bye.